Good morning, everybody. Good morning to our online friends. So this is actually my first hybrid conference to organize. So bear with us as we try to include everybody, people who are here, and thank you so much for coming in person and people who are online. So I'd like to welcome you to the Elliott School, and thanks for coming. My name is Susan Aronson. I'm a professor here at the Elliott School and an organizer of this conference along with Adam Zabel. And so today our first speaker is the Dean of the Elliott School, Dr. Alyssa Ayres. Ayres?
Hi, everyone. Good morning and welcome to George Washington University and the Elliott School. Welcome to the Lindner Family Commons. Thank you. I will echo Professor Aronson's welcome to those of you who have come in person. It's always wonderful to reconvene in person after so much time spent online and in virtual environments. I am really delighted that the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub has joined with so many other partners to organize this conference on our immersive digital future, which, as you can see, is convened both online and in person appropriately. But thanks to all of you for joining today. In the international affairs field, we're increasingly aware of the real complexity of these kinds of cross-cutting challenges that span just multiple issue areas. You can see that the digital economy and technological advances, as you all know, raise still unresolved questions about governance, regulation, ownership, and also ethics and equity and economics, to name just a few. So we're grateful that the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub, led by Professor Susan Aronson, has kept its eyes focused squarely on these kinds of emerging developments in this space and their implications for international affairs. The Hub has been educating the public and policymakers about data governance, data-driven change, and digital trade since 2019. I'd like to offer a special word of thanks to our funders at the Ford and the Minderoo Foundations, Meta at GDIT, the XR Association, and GW Cyber. Meta, the US Army, and the US Air Force have generously provided XR programs and headsets. So we want to thank our partners within George Washington University, as well as those externally. You'll be able to see them on the slides that we have. And let me also thank Adam Zabel, who worked closely with Professor Aronson in conceiving and organizing this conference, as well as Kyle Renner of the Institute for International Economic Policy, the Hub staff, Ian Wheeler and Siaka Plagala, and also Robin Kahn from our Dean's team here at the Elliott School. As we get ready to kick off, let's keep in mind the words of Satya Nadella, CEO of Microsoft. He said that the Metaverse is here, and it's not only transforming how we see the world, but how we participate in it. We don't know how these technologies, the XR technologies, may affect global governance and international relations. But I think we'll have a better understanding of the issues at stake following today's program and the discussions that you'll have here. And I look forward to getting started. Thank you and welcome again.
Thank you, Dean Ayres, for that warm welcome. So my job today is basically to introduce the speakers and to keep the speakers on time, because we really want to make sure that we have two jam-packed days. And so I'm going to be rude and horrible, because I'll be running around with little pieces of paper that say 5 minutes left next or something like that. So I'm going to now introduce our next speaker, who is Elizabeth Hyman, who is the CEO of the XR Association, Extended Reality Association, who is going to give us an overview of how immersive technologies affect and may challenge some long-standing policies. So Elizabeth, thank you so much.
Perfect, thank you so much. Let me just take a moment here to share a screen. Sensitive mouse. And bring my glasses with me. Oops. And now the screen went blank. There we go. I'm just looking for the slide share. It's a little bit different. Yeah. Sorry about that. We're getting it off to Slow start. There we go. That's what I was looking for. Thanks. Fingers crossed. No persnickety.
There's a tiny icon at the very bottom.
Lower right.
There we
right.
go. There we go. Success. All right, thank you. All right, sorry about that. So good morning, and it's a pleasure to be here, and particularly for such a wonderful event that is looking at such a broad global approach and discussion around this burgeoning area of immersive technology. So as Susan said, my name is Liz Hyman, and my job this morning is to try to set the stage for these conversations that are going to follow what I'm talking about, so that we're all roughly in the same place in terms of what the technology is, what some of the opportunities are in terms of how XR is being used, and what some of the policy issues and challenges are likely to be. So first, a really quick word about my organization. Let's see if it'll work. No. Let's see if this will work. No. Okay. Maybe I'll just leave the slide up. Let's see, it doesn't really want to go forward, but look, the XR Association, we're a nonprofit industry trade association, and we represent the growing ecosystem of companies that power, thank you, the virtual, augmented, and mixed reality technologies. And our mission is, that is working now, to promote the responsible development and thoughtful advancement of XR technologies. So I understand that following my remarks, there's going to be a really impressive presentation that's going to go into how the technology actually works. So I'm not going to get into that. Suffice it to say, for those of you that aren't familiar, XR is an umbrella term for virtual, augmented, and mixed reality technologies, and also for immersive technologies that have yet to be invented. So in the last couple of years, we've seen solid growth in this industry, and the advent of the Metaverse is expected to drive even more growth as we go forward. Statista estimates that the global market for AR, VR, and MR in 2021 was $28 billion, pretty solid. But to put this into context, GfK has indicated that the global smartphone market for the same year was $365 billion. So we're growing, it's healthy, and I'm more convinced than ever that this will be the next computing platform, but we're still at the lower level of the innovation curve, and these statistics tend to reflect that. The equipment, while relatively easy to use, some of you may get a chance to experience that today, it's still a little chunky in some places. We represent ourselves in avatars, sometimes in that we don't even have legs, so go figure. But we're getting there, and ubiquitous broadband is also an issue, right, in terms of how this is going to be deployed. The good news is that it means that we have some time to have some candid and constructive conversations about the opportunities and challenges that this technology presents. And my organization, the XR Association, and many, many, many others are doing just that. So I want to start on the opportunity side. I think it's vital that policymakers and the public understand how this technology is being used and the many benefits that that confers. So while the technology is still poised to make many leaps and bounds forward, it has still progressed to such a state that we can see much more clearly how it promotes presence and interaction in a way that the internet today really doesn't afford us. And it is awe-inspiring, frankly, to see how it is being used. So for example, in the healthcare space, we're seeing therapeutic applications such as pain mitigation, pain management, physical therapy that mitigates the need for drug interventions and lowers the need for anesthesia. We're seeing terrific uses to address things like PTSD or autism. So lots of great advances there. The potential for workforce training, whether it's for the doctors and nurses in the healthcare space or line workers in auto plants or union trades everywhere. It's really significant and being used now in very exciting ways. Equally, teachers and educators are more and more using immersive technologies to not only convey complex issues in the classroom, but also to make remote learning more impactful. First responders, such as firemen, are using this technology in virtual training simulations that are very safe so that they can address the very dangerous real life scenarios that they'll face in their jobs. And of course, scores of us are using VR. I did it this morning for our fitness workouts to explore places and locations that we might not otherwise be able to go to in real life, or through shared immersive spaces. And yet, as we all know, the increased digitization, as the Dean mentioned, is raising work in our work and personal lives, is raising many, many issues that we need to address. How do we usher in new technologies in a way that is responsible, safe, and inclusive? And we're seeing these debates play out not just in the XR space, but across emerging technologies like AI, robotics, IoT, the whole plethora that we see. And how do we balance the support for innovation with meaningful protection for the consumer? So when it comes to addressing these issues, I believe the XR industry is at an advantage, as I said earlier, in that we're still sort of relatively in the early days of these conversations, and we're going to progress as we go forward in terms of form factor, functionality, cost, et cetera. But this conference is an example of how we bring together academia, government, industry, and others to learn and exchange ideas. So I thought a good place to start this conversation is to share with you some findings from a partnership we had with a think tank here in Washington, D.C. called the Bipartisan Policy Center. Many of you may be familiar with BPC, and we worked with them to help produce a series of convenings that, like this event, brought together a multitude of stakeholders to surface the opportunities and challenges for XR. And they also recently authored a white paper that I commend to you. It's available on their website as well as ours, that set out several areas for consideration, but I'm going to kind of run through a few of them quickly today. So the first area that I wanted to discuss is privacy. Certainly AR is similar to some of the conversations we're having about mobile technologies, mobile AR, I should say. But a head-mounted display has forward-facing cameras, it has sensors, and in the not-too-distant future, there may be capabilities such as eye tracking and other ways to process biometric information and data. So not surprisingly, the top area of concern in the BPC process was in fact data privacy. In particular, how do we approach biometric and bystander privacy, which will obviously be a key to building trust in the technology and advancing its adoption. The biometric data raises issues around privacy and inferences that may be made with such data, which if not addressed responsibly, certainly can result in bias and discrimination. And bystander privacy raises questions about meaningful consent and privacy from being recorded in areas such as in private locations or in civic gatherings. Another area in the privacy discussion that was interesting during the course of the BPC process had to do with avatars. On the one hand, the choice of an avatar is empowering because you can choose to represent yourself as you wish to be represented, regardless of whether you were comfortable doing so in real life. And yet, this also may raise privacy issues that are not obvious at first glance. Also discussed in the BPC process was XR in the workplace, which may well raise issues about the relationship between the employer and the employee. The BPC conversation sought to try to identify some solutions or measures that various actors could take to address some of this. But with all the issue sets that I'm going to discuss here today, I think it's important to state there wasn't necessarily consensus about which one should be adopted or how we should proceed, but it was a great opportunity to surface some of these things. And so when it came to issues around privacy, some of the items that were raised in the BPC process included things like facial blurring, geofencing, privacy by default, anonymizing avatars, employing non-identifying usernames, using design aspects such as light signaling to indicate that an AR device is on and recording, reducing the specificity of location tracking services, providing user-based opt-out options, minimizing data collection to what is necessary, and defining and requiring meaningful consent. And many of these things are already being employed by various actors in the industry, but certainly the conversation is going to continue, what's feasible, what's not, upsides, downsides. Certainly, we're going to see a lot more conversation in this area, and particularly about what constitutes meaningful consent and how it is used in the context of bystander privacy. Many of these things are obviously already in the purview of existing law like GDPR or CCPA, and others, we have industry best practices. I think we at XRA and many others have long supported in the United States a federal approach to data privacy laws, and obviously there's a lot of conversations that are taking place there. But we need to look at all of these things, figure out where the gaps are, and then have thoughtful discussions about how best practices or thoughtful updates of regulations can address some of this. So something related obviously to privacy is data security. That came up during this BPC process. It's often a key factor in protecting users' sensitive data and privacy when devices collect and store information about them. As XR devices become more dynamic and are able to store, upload, download, offload data, XR technology will have to protect against security risks that we see elsewhere, such as malware attacks, data breaches, and data theft. The BPC white paper identified some recommendations to address security concerns, and those included things like securing vulnerable data via encryption, auto-deleting data that is no longer needed, and considering storing data on the device itself rather than a centralized repository. Wherever possible, restricting the use and distribution of unauthorized data and informing users of risk that they assume when using the technology was the recommended default in the conversation through the BPC process. The next topic covered, immersive technologies can create considerable opportunities and challenges for the economy and society in terms of labor markets and business models. Given the power of XR for workforce training, which is significant, I'm really bullish on that particular piece, and for upskilling. There's no doubt in my mind that if they're not already, workers, governments, businesses should prepare to take advantage of this technology for that purpose. Workforce training programs are starting to incorporate XR technologies to help boost productivity and economic growth. But again, no doubt there's going to be policy discussions around issues such as antitrust, privacy, intellectual property, and legal liabilities that will have major implications for corporate monetization strategies and R&D investments. And the BPC white paper again identified some considerations for us to weigh as we consider the economic implications. Education and workforce training should leverage the economic benefits of immersive technologies when appropriate. The efficacy of using XR for workforce training should be further studied to figure out how to make it most impactful and good for the workforce. Existing laws and policies around issues like R&D subsidies, antitrust, intellectual property, these all need to be further studied. We're still in the early days of conversations around those. Also, marketers should be mindful of how their advertisements influence features and adoption of technology and implications for inclusion. BPC process also spent time examining access barriers to XR technologies. Like many emerging technologies, the cost of XR can be a barrier and exacerbate digital divides and create even greater stratification in terms of technical literacy. So while the cost of XR hardware is definitely coming down, it's still unaffordable to too many. And also high-speed broadband, as I mentioned earlier, is necessary for high-resolution immersive experiences. And without adequate technical literacy and learned skills, XR can be challenging for some to use. I'm thinking of my 90-year-old father. It can be a little challenging for him. So participants in the BPC process suggested an expansion of community labs, skill building initiatives at universities, public-private partnerships, vouchers for training programs to help prepare the workforce, and XR training tools for non-tech savvy individuals as ways in which to ensure broad-based adoption and access. And again, many of these recommendations are already being implemented, but will need to be scaled up over time. So a related topic to access is how XR has the potential to exacerbate or mitigate inequities. I'm going to stumble on that word. On the one hand, some XR tools present solutions for people, for example, with disabilities, but without a concerted effort to build in accessibility features in XR, it can also pose challenges. And on the one hand, real world exclusionary practices can transfer into the XR space and lead to discrimination and bias, and yet XR is also being used to combat biases through immersive experiences and trainings. More research will need to be done to figure out how to scale this up, but XR is the ultimate empathy machine, I think is very real and effective in this context. One thing that the XR Association made clear, we put out a developer's guide, and one of the chapters had to do with accessibility. And we, in that guide, indicated that designers, developers, creators, and testers of the technology should represent demographically diverse communities and understand a wide range of inclusivity and accessibility related concerns. And it may also be necessary to examine privacy settings and encryption settings and tools and ensure that existing regulations, including anti-discrimination laws, be reviewed and, if appropriate, updated. The last topic that the BPC process went through had to do with safety measures to protect individuals' physical and emotional well-being and safety online. And these obviously are going to be essential if we're going to achieve the widespread adoption of XR. Many hardware manufacturers already employ very good safeguards to protect users' physical safety, such as pre-established physical boundaries, warning labels, and guidelines. And again, harkening back to our best practices guide, the XR Association has published a set of best practices for developers and platforms to address physical and psychological comforts in XR. And as the technology progresses, these best practices will need to be updated. We'll continue to sort of assess and update as needed. XRA also issued another chapter. It had to do with a focus on culture, conduct, and content in immersive environments, where we shared immersive experiences, whether for social, gaming, or in a work enterprise use. Developers should take certain concrete steps to encourage positive behavior and be clear about the purpose and intent of that immersive experience. Make sure that there are clear, understandable conduct policies, and of course, that all immersive experiences abide by the laws and requirements that you're operating under in your jurisdiction. But clearly, we all need to do more and do it to safeguard and protect XR users' mental safety. And the BPC paper, again, identified some ideas for us to weigh and consider. Things like content moderation, reporting abuse, blocking certain users, setting virtual buffers, and placing appropriate privacy restrictions. Again, many of these are now being deployed. We need to continue to scale those up. And there's no doubt that further research will be needed on the potential impacts of XR, and in particular in the area of children's development and other safety concerns. And I wanted to point out, I know this is a global audience, but there is something here in the United States. It's called the Children in Media Research Advancement Act, the CAMERA Act. It authorizes the National Institutes of Health to lead a research program on technology and media's effect on children, and in core areas of cognitive, physical, and socio-emotional development. And we, the XR Association, support that legislation and the sentiment behind it. We must be very thoughtful about how XR is used by young people. Hardware manufacturers have guidance that suggests that this should not be used by young children. But there are many extremely positive use cases for young kids in the medical context to mitigate pain or address things like autism. But steady as she goes, and we need to make sure that this is approached in a thoughtful and consistent manner. So at the beginning of my remarks, I said something about the metaverse. And I think that many consider the metaverse, or whatever it's ultimately going to be called, to be the next generation of the internet, an embodied internet. And while it's still somewhat undefined, last week I was at an event and I heard the CEO of Unity, John Riccitello, describe it as always real time, mostly 3D, mostly interactive, mostly social, and mostly persistent. And I thought that was an interesting addition to how we're talking about it. It's not a bad way to describe it, as today most people will access the metaverse through their computer in a 2D environment, and as we progress then to a more immersive experience. So online game platforms like Roblox or Minecraft could be considered a metaverse, as people can come create, participate in a game scenario with others and at their own pace and time, and exchange assets of value. But the other thing to understand about the metaverse is that it need not only be in sort of the gaming or social environment, it can also be used in enterprise. The government of Seoul, South Korea, for example, is working to have many of its public services put into a metaverse, a persistent shared digital experience, where presumably I can, if I were a citizen of Seoul, I could go into this metaverse as an avatar, get in line with a stranger that I don't know, to do something like get my driver's license renewed or something along those lines. So in the next 5 to 10 years, I think we will access these locations more and more frequently through our immersive devices, through virtual reality and augmented glasses, making such an experience far more powerful as you're sharing three-dimensional spaces with others. You'll have things like spatial audio, which will enrich and deepen that experience. So it's progressing as we go along. And in addition to the policy issues that were raised in the BPC paper, I would also add to the list that the metaverse will require us to consider things like financial models and transactions. So in particular, what's the role of things like NFTs and cryptocurrency and other distributed financial tools, and how they operate and should be regulated. And many believe that the ultimate success of the metaverse will require interoperability, so that consumers can easily navigate different spaces in the metaverse, bringing with them their avatar, their data, their digital assets if they so desire. And that's going to require both significant technical and policy advancements as the metaverse becomes more fully realized. It'll take, again, all of us, industry, civil society, academia, legal minds, and government to sort through the array of issues that I've outlined. Moreover, as we think about international law, which will be obviously discussed quite at length today, what are the international law and trade rules? How will they operate in the metaverse? So there's so much to sort through, and I'm very excited about this conversation. Okay, so that's a run through of the many issues that are being talked about when it comes to XR. But let me just offer a few sort of broad observations on how to think about these issues in a policy context. First, I would suggest that a productive starting point is that rules should be technology neutral as best as possible. Data is being generated on our phones, our wearable devices, smart home devices, on the web, and of course, amongst the growing category of XR devices. And there are a couple of compelling reasons for why tech neutral is sort of a good starting point. One, of course, is the old saw, and you all are familiar with this, that technology often moves faster than policymaking. So let's not make it more complicated than we have to. There are a lot of technological advancements yet to be realized, not just for XR, but other emerging technologies. And making regulations that are too specific to a particular technology or too pegged to a particular time, it means that they could become obsolete very quickly. So we should try as best as possible to future-proof our efforts. But also, perhaps most compelling, is that we want to make it easier for consumers to understand what they're looking at when it comes to a clear set of rules. I also believe that it will be important for policymakers to take what I would call a layered approach to this process. We know that there are a number of existing laws, standards, and agreements that already apply in some way, shape, or form to XR, not to mention many of the industry best practices that are out there. So the first step is to identify the issues that might arise through the use of XR. And then next, identify what the gaps are. And then how do we address some of those gaps at both a domestic and international level? We, the industry, think tanks, civil society, lawyers, all of us, also must acknowledge the role that we will play in educating policymakers to share with them the stories about how XR is being used today, but also how we try to close the knowledge and skills gap for their understanding of the technology and make sure that they are well informed. It's in everyone's best interest to actively engage and learn from one another. So I hope this overview has been helpful. I'm trying to stick to time. If you're interested in keeping up with what we do and what the industry does, if you are so inclined to scan that QR code, it'll take you to our website. You can sign up for our industry alert newsletter, which gives a little update of what we're doing, but also is an amalgamation of what's happening across the industry. So thank you for your time this morning. I hope that was helpful. If there's time, I can take a question or not. So.
I'd like